Hello there, it's Stephanie Franklin. I'm the co-presenter with David Rivas, and today I will be presenting to you the Rhetorical Précis. If you've not read and completed the directed annotating of the Margaret K. Woodward's piece, The Rhetorical Précis, I'd like to invite you to stop here and read that piece first, then come back at a later time to see this presentation on the Rhetorical Précis. Woodward shares some insightful information on why she developed the Rhetorical Précis and some interesting statistics on its usage. Her piece was written 17 years ago, and certainly more teachers and instructors have become familiar with this type of summarizing. She ends her piece by suggesting that the précis is something that should be taught in high school. Certainly she created this template to assist college students, yet many teachers have found it useful in assisting our students in accessing more rigorous and challenging texts in high school. So even if you're familiar with rhetorical précis, please continue to view this section as I have examples and suggestions of how the précis may work in a variety of situations and how it can be extended and tweaked to meet different needs. So let's get started. Okay, so this is the format or the handout that I give my students in August when I am teaching them how to write a rhetorical précis. And we will write several, or they will write several rhetorical précis during that first month of school. And we'll continue to use this format in extended and tweaked and modified versions throughout the entire school year. And so students tend to become pretty good at analyzing and summarizing a text and pulling out information. Remember the directed annotating from the Woodward reading that we asked you to do? Well, it will be used in completing the rhetorical précis. And if you have your students do this type of directed annotating, they'll be prepared with the needed information to complete the précis as well. So in part one, you are asked to introduce the speaker, the writer of the text, and the central claim. And so here, students are first have to determine what type of text they're reading, and sometimes they don't always think about it that way. It's just the reading assignment. So is the assignment a poem? It is a play. Is it a short story? Is it an article? Is it an essay? Is it a speech that you're actually responding to? And then they will need to include the title of the text. They'll need to include the author's first and last name, and then information about the author. And so if that's not presented in the text, and it's not presented somewhere in their textbook or in the piece that you've given them, or if they're commenting or writing rhetorical précis on an outside piece that you've asked them to bring in, they should do a little bit of research to find out something about the author. This adds credibility to the source, and they should know something about the person who they are summarizing. Then next they're asked to use a rhetorical verb such as claims, argues, asserts, suggests, or reasons, and there's a host of others that they could use. The students just want to be careful that they don't make a statement that is not true. For example, if they were to use the word states and the author has not directly stated this or that, they would not be presenting a true statement. So sometimes I have to caution them about that, but they can choose from a variety of rhetorical verbs to use here. And following the word that, the student should then include what they think to be the central claim of the entire piece. They've already identified this in their directed annotating, and so they would put that into this place in the structure or in the template. The students may quote directly from the text, or they may rephrase it into their own words. Next, in part two, which is really the meat of the entire piece, and this piece I'm going to spend a little bit more time with because it can have varying kind of length to it. For example, this particular example that I would give them in the beginning, at the beginning of the school year, has part two is one single sentence in which they are going to put all three pieces of evidence into this one punctuated sentence. And so we can immediately see how this can be expanded. And the example that I'll share with you from one of my students, the students are expanding that right away. I think we maybe write with this one sentence, maybe the first or the second time that we write the précis. What they can then do is they can expand that single sentence by, let's get a marker here. Okay, not working. But they can expand that sentence by ending after the first piece of evidence. He or she, referring to the author, supports this claim by first, they would add their first piece of evidence, follow it with a period, and then they would move on to the next sentence. So they could make it 3 sentences. Later, you can ask the students here to add an additional citing for a piece of evidence and then cite from the text in support of what they assert to be the evidence. So you would do that with evidence 1 and evidence 2 and evidence 3, and it builds sort of the development of the second section, so that by the end of the term or by the end of the first semester, they should be writing pretty full rhetorical précis on things they're summarizing. I do also, there's a note at the bottom here to encourage them to use something like toward the end of the text or something like that, using this prepositional phrase to kind of add a little bit of variance to their writing. In part 3, explain the author's purpose. In this section, the student is being asked to begin with the author's last name and then to identify what the overall purpose of the piece is. Why would the author write it? The second part of this is in order to do what? So why does he write it? And then what does he hope to accomplish by writing it? What does the author want the audience to do or to feel as a result of having read his piece? This one ends up being 1 sentence, but as students begin to write and understand sort of their interaction with the text, they also develop this, and sometimes I'll see this in more than 1 sentence as well. So you get to part 4. Next, ask the student to state the tone and the intended audience. And so part of the directed annotating was directed toward identifying the tone of the piece through the diction and the choice of words that the author uses. And identifying that helps them to see what feeling they should have toward the text or what feeling the author wants them to have. And so they would note that here with a descriptive adjective. And then lastly, who is the intended audience? Who is the writer intending this to be for? And this is kind of tricky for students at the beginning because they think that it's for, the person reading it. But who did the author have in mind, and who was he directing that toward? And helping students to establish that here also helps when they're writing, for them to identify their audience and direct their tone at the message they want to send to a particular audience. So we find that pretty valuable, and that usually ends up being about 1 sentence. Now, in the Mary Kay Woodworth's piece, the rhetorical précis, she only identifies 4 parts to her précis, and she is the creator of it. I'm not really sure exactly where this 5th part comes from. Explain the significance. I did check. I've been teaching this about 8 years, and it appears I went back and checked, and when I first began teaching it, I only taught 4 parts. So sometime over the last maybe 6 or 7 years, I came up with this 5th part. I'm not sure if I included it or if I found someone else had a template and it was included with that template, or if I found that I thought over time that it was important that they understand why the text was important or why it is significant. So you can include part 5 if you'd like, or not. I think at some point during the year I do use the rhetorical précis as I tweak it and have them use it as the introductory paragraph for a paper. Those points in part 2 work really well with creating the body of an essay. And so maybe I added part 5 as a place for them to put their thesis statement. I'm not really certain, but I don't think that it hurts anything for them to identify why this text might be significant. But I'll leave that one up to you. So we've covered the 5 parts, the 4 parts from Woodworth, and then that 5th part that I'm not sure where that came in at, but it's something that I use all the time. What I'd like to do now is go ahead and take a look at the next slide, which has one of my students' an example of a rhetorical précis from one of my students. Okay, so this is Real Student. And Real Student has written a rhetorical précis on an article, a scholarly article that she herself researched, and was asked to print out, to read, to annotate, and then to write a rhetorical précis on it. So it is not necessarily an article that I have read, it is one that she was asked to bring in. Writing these kinds of rhetorical précis on research articles is another good way for preparing to write a research paper. If the students have to have 3 or 4 sources in their paper, for them to do this type of summarizing with each of those sources can be really beneficial to make sure that they have engaged with the piece and that they know what the writer is saying, and that they can then, utilize that and determine whether or not it would be worthy to utilize in their paper or worth utilizing in their paper. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at Real Student's paper. In the beginning, Real Student begins using the précis correctly. She says in the essay, an analysis of civil disobedience, A.G. Ashkoff, student at Dartmouth University, suggests that in the tradition of civil disobedience, the purpose of violating a law has been to appeal to the conscience of the community and having injustice recognized and the law repealed. I think this is a good identification of the central claim. But as we read through the piece, I think that she could have added a bit more to that, but certainly she gets all of the pieces in to that first part. Next, she begins with identifying what she believes to be the central claim, the 3 pieces. He supports his claim by first explaining that the conscientious refusal to obey is demonstrated in the speech and behavior of the disobedient. It is important for the case you are fighting against to appeal to the public conscience or the moral sensibility of the community to consider whether a law or command is just. Thoreau argues that the government rarely proves itself useful, and he tries to convince his readers that it is unjust and they should refuse to follow the law. His method is persuasion, thus attempting to inform the people of the injustice so they can follow. Then he contrasts those who participate in civil disobedience to those who demonstrate self-interested behavior of a criminal or the subversive behavior of a revolutionary. There is a difference between one who is being civil disobedient and one with the behavior of a revolutionary. The person who is being civil disobedient is conscientiously refusing to obey and has the public appeal. They make sure that they have the people convinced that the injustice in which they are trying to reform is immoral in the first place. Someone with the behavior of a revolutionary has the self-interested behavior of a criminal. They do not act for the greater good, but for what benefits them. And so you can see in her first 2 points that they're certainly much longer than just one sentence, and that she has expanded because she has found it necessary to do that if she's going to fully summarize the piece. And so they tend to do this after a while. What she hasn't done is she hasn't directly cited from the text, but she certainly has paraphrased what she's saying here, because she's paraphrasing here what he says about Thoreau, and she's paraphrasing in other places, which is acceptable to do, although I do try to encourage them to also, cite directly from the piece. Okay, let's go to the next page. And here she makes her last point as she concludes. Finally, he makes a point in which government committing injustice cannot demand a nonviolent response from protesters. Thoreau believes that governments act with coercion rather than act on the basis of principle. Therefore, people have a right to resist the coercion of governments. They do not have to succumb to the injustices of unlawful government. Toward the end of the text, Ishkoff states that we need to stand by our deeds and be confident of the justice of our cause. And here she ends with her final piece, and she's going to move into the purpose statement. Ishkoff's purpose is to encourage the offering of a moral defense of the law in order to promote a just government where everyone has a say. And then lastly, she goes with the tone in the audience. He establishes an inspiring tone for those who are afraid to try to reform what they believe is unjust. This work is significant because civil disobedience is important for the integrity of social order. There we are. And so she's completed. She's gotten all of the 5 parts in. Still like that 5th part with the work adding the significance, and she has done a pretty good job. I'd like to share with you really quickly, and I'll move through it much faster, one more example in the next slide. Okay, so here we have another real student, And this is her rhetorical praise, same assignment, commentary on Thoreau's civil disobedience. And she begins within the article, Thoreau's radical movement in ours, when Stevenson, an independent journalist and climate activist, claims that Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, remains to have a strong influence even after so many years of Thoreau's readiness to speak the truth, the way he suggests people need to recognize what is wrong and to act to change what is wrong. And so again, here in this first sentence, we see that she has all the parts added, and she has in the article, Thoreau's Radical Movement, she's got the type, she's got the author, and the title of the article, and then the author and the author's background. I wanted to show this one because what she does here is she supports with text. In her first claim, she with specific text, with citing from the piece. He supports his claim by first pointing out how Thoreau gets down to the principles, unquote, and addresses problems that he feels are wrong with the Mexican-American War, slavery, the talk of secession, and how people need to wait for a vote in the state house. And so here she does the same thing. She moves. Just wanted again just to show this piece to show you the length of the body and how long it is, and her purpose statement doesn't start until down here. And so students should be encouraged to extend. If you need to use that, use the first template in the single sentence maybe for the very first teaching of it, but after that students should be ready to begin to expand their thinking. Go to the last page. He establishes the didactic tone for activist students and anyone in general that have radical thoughts on certain issues. The work is significant because it explains why Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, is so influential by explaining should be Thoreau's way of addressing problems and how he talks about acting is the only true way to change the world. And so again, we have an example of a student moving through each of those pieces of the rhetorical précis, but again, you can see how it can be developed so that it is not a real quick summary, but that is really a more detailed summary. And as I mentioned before, the students can use that in preparation for doing research, for writing a paper. I mean, the possibilities are just endless for that. So I want to thank you for your time and thank you for listening. We do have an assignment for you, and that assignment is for you to write your own rhetorical praises on the Mary Kay Woodward's piece, the rhetorical praises. And David will provide a place for you to upload that in our Google Classroom, and I think that will do it for this evening. So again, thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Have